I'm so glad you're here with me tonight.
Thank you for having me.
So, can you just start off by just, introducing yourself a little bit and maybe just let our listeners know a little bit about you and what you do?
Sure. Yeah. So my name's Reilly Scott, and I am a very old friend of yours, Cora. I live here in Kenora. I'm a singer-songwriter, and I also do community development work here in Kenora that's focused on the arts primarily, but also involves teaching yoga and breath work and a variety of other things. But I primarily have interests personally um, in creativity and arts for social change, and using the arts as a vessel for personal transformation and healing. Yeah.
That's a that's a spectacular introduction.
Thank you.
Wonderful. And I mean, for people listening, like you said, we go way back and we've just kind of really learned in the last number of years that we really align with a lot of, interests and hopes and desires and struggles and everything. So that's why we're here together talking tonight.
Mhm.
Specifically, we're interested in really kind of touching on some things to do with the nervous system and all the glory that involves. It's
Mhm.
gonna be great.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and I have so many questions I can ask you because you've been a constant kind of inspiration to me and you know so much. So, to start, just to get us started, I want to talk a little bit about high sensitivity
Mm.
and what it means to be a quote unquote highly sensitive person. Because I think, just those words come with kind of a bit of a stereotype or expectation of what that kind of means on the surface, but it can mean something quite a lot more. So, in your own journey and learning and understanding, how do you define what highly sensitive actually means? What does it mean to you? Or
Yeah. Pardon me?
just like from what you've learned about high sensitivity?
Yeah. So to me, it means a lot of different things. I think that that's been a really big piece of the puzzle for me, and it's still something that I'm really working on understanding. Um, but I've been learning a little bit about, I mean, I feel like there are different kind of like definitions of that, and people use it like a loose term for different things. But I think there's some sort of like a statistic around like what percentage of the population actually qualify, quote unquote, as being highly sensitive people, or like empaths, I guess would be another way of describing it. And for me, I feel like it's just been something that I've always had, but I like really didn't understand for most of my life. I just knew that different things were just felt very difficult for me. Um, and I found a lot of like interpersonal interactions very challenging to manage and very overwhelming.
Mm,
Um, and for me, I sort of gradually came to understand that for my system, it seemed to be almost like a sensitivity to like emotions and emotional energy in other people as well as in myself. And being in like large groups of people would be like, I sort of feel like I describe myself as an extroverted introvert. So when I'm around large groups of people, it's like extremely exhausting, and I have to go then and spend time on my own to recharge. And I think that whole extrovert introvert thing can be connected to being highly sensitive, but also can be like a separate thing. But um, I just know for myself, it was sort of understanding that I could sense and feel. It felt like an extra sense, like I could sense and feel the emotional climate of somebody else. And it's weird because I feel like that is often seen as being this really like woohoo kind of out there thing. And I think that's sort of why it took me such a long time to really start to even begin to unpack that or understand it or even have like a certain degree of respect for it. Because for most of my life, I just felt like I just did not understand what was going on with me in that sense. Um,
Is
and
that
I also, oh, sorry, go ahead.
just quickly, is that something that you remember from like essentially as before you could remember, or that you kind of grew into that?
Yeah, I think for me, and like I can only speak personally from my own experiences, but I feel like for me, it's a combination of genetic inherited traits, as well as environmental factors that affected my already highly attuned nervous system to a state of hypervigilance, essentially. So I feel like there can be a lot of different things that contribute to it. For myself, yeah, I do feel like it's largely genetic. I know it definitely runs in my family. This sort of trait of sensitivity. I know that a lot of the time people that identify as like artists or creatives tend to have that. It's like you can almost just feel like you're this like open, raw, exposed nerve. And it's like if you don't learn how to manage that with a lot of like grounding tools, I'm just starting to learn this now, honestly. And a lot of like self-regulating tools, I think, and co-regulating tools, it can feel very it can be like just debilitating to function in the world in that way. And that's definitely what I found for a lot of my life.
Yeah, so on that, like you were sort of touching on, there's so many beautiful aspects of being highly sensitive, like
Mhm.
empathetic towards others, and I think, wanting others to feel good, like that's a good trait to have as a person. But what are the harm?
Mhm.
Where does this become a danger to the self?
Um, yeah, I mean, I feel like for me, that just goes into this topic of nervous system that you kind of mentioned opening our conversation up. Um, so I don't know if you feel ready to kind of delve into that arena, which I would be happy to. um,
I mean, they're gonna kind of commingle. You've already mentioned the words regulation, so at some point
mhm.
explain what you mean by that. But yeah, delve in. Tell us whatever you'd like in terms of nervous system and sensitivity and your own journey.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for saying your own journey. Cause I was just thinking that like it might help for anyone who's listening to this for me to like explain a little bit about why I even became interested in these topics. Um, so for me, um, there was always that high sensitivity piece. And I definitely knew that certain things were challenging for me. I knew I needed a lot of alone time. I knew that I had challenges around stimulation, feeling really like overstimulated very easily, all of these things that I was kind of always working with. Um, I always, from a very young age as a child, experienced definitely always a certain degree of sort of chronic generalized anxiety, I would say, that kind of ranged from anywhere to like manageable to what felt completely unmanageable. And that was something that I always kind of dealt with quietly in my life and tried to kind of just, get on with things. And I made it all the way through university and I did very well. Um, and especially like at that time, like I went into university in 2003 and this is like a whole other topic. I even have a hard time describing anxious symptoms as being mental health related. And I want to be careful with that because I'm a huge advocate for mental health. And I really believe that it's important that we talk about it openly. But for myself and what I've learned about anxiety on my own journey, for me, in relation to the nervous system, and emotional regulation, it really is like a full body thing. And so I struggle with this concept of like this idea of like mental health versus physical health, because from
Interesting.
what I've learned about mental health, like a big part of my journey has been really understanding how it's totally like mind and body. But anyway, what ended up happening eventually was I had lots going on within my whole system, and eventually found out that I was experiencing an autoimmune illness that's called Hashimoto's thyroiditis, which is actually way more common, I think, than we know. And basically, it involves an attack on the thyroid by the immune system. And I sort of track that back to um, starting about 17 years ago, when I went through a really stressful interpersonal time when my parents separated and then divorced. And yeah, I think I might have mentioned this already, but they often say that, yeah, that's the case with autoimmunity, that um, genes load the gun and environment pulls the trigger. And often, what from what I've read and learned, that yeah, it's typically some kind of um, it's, I mean, not surprisingly, stress, or some kind of major stressful event that precipitates the onset of this illness. And so I experienced close to 20 years, really, of all kinds of extremely wacky mental, emotional, and physical symptoms that I just did not understand at all. And so, um, really, it culminated in a very challenging time in my life, where I just, and I'm still kind of in the midst of it now, but where it was just a really terrible health crisis, basically, and every kind of end of the spectrum. So um, so that kind of led me down this path of like, okay, what the hell is actually going on for me? And how did this, and like, what can I, because I was not finding answers within the conventional healthcare system. And like, I've been very grateful to have really wonderful health professionals definitely on my path. And like, I'm really grateful for those people. I think it just, the way things kind of turned out for me, it wasn't like this cut and dry sort of thing. It was like this very, very complex, multi-layered
Yeah.
thing. So yeah. So I can't even remember. Oh, that was leading up to nervous system stuff. So yeah. So along with the Hashimoto's, just a lot of other, I mean, symptoms really connected to the Hashis, which is hormonal. So just a lot of like, mood stuff, and then it's autoimmune, so it's inflammatory. And so it just sort of started me asking questions like, what's going on in my body that is causing this degree of stress, and really started me on this holistic health journey. And one of the things that I learned on my path, because I was trying to sort of look at every kind of angle of this, and one of the most profound things that I learned about, which I've become pretty obsessed with, is this concept of toxic stress, or a word a lot of people don't like to use, and that's trauma. Um, and and that led me on this path of understanding how a lot of early experiences that I had had in my life had shaped my nervous system in a certain way to predispose me to this sort of chronic hyperactive um, fight or flight response. And and also just what's kind of referred to as nervous system dysregulation. which I'm really sharing a lot. So this is like, do you want me to stop or have any questions or anything?
No, no, it's going on a lot of good. I trust
Okay.
you're gonna answer the questions that I'm gonna ask anyways, so just keep.
Okay. Yeah. So basically, what that looks like in terms of nervous system dysregulation is that when you go through periods of chronic stress, where you don't your body doesn't really get a break from it, and you're under this state where your body is basically, it feels like it's sensing chronic threat. So the way that I have learned to view it is that we're mammals, just like any other mammal in the wild. The only difference is we're, more intellectually evolved. Um, but our bodies sense threat in exactly the same way as any other mammals. So, in our prehistoric caveman times, it would be, you have like the saber-toothed tiger chasing you. And now we have the exact same physiological response, only it's, chronic emotional stress, or, being constantly stimulated by technology. But for me, a lot of it I can trace back to now what I understand to be, and I don't think this is uncommon, and it's why I want to talk about it more. But just, I would say, um, generational patterns within my family, basically, um, that has a lot to do with like relationships and attachment and that kind of thing. And it all just has to do with feeling safe in relationship, really. And if you don't have that from an early age, your nervous system gets stuck in this stress response, basically. And along with being stuck in that stress, like our bodies aren't designed to be stuck in this stress response for long periods of time. It's not designed to be there for, very long at all, never mind months or even years. Um, and that causes all kinds of physiological imbalance in the body, basically. And, you have the whole extremely high cortisol, which, like you and I were talking about earlier, eventually bottoms out and becomes low. So you can't get out of bed in the morning. Um, Systemic inflammation, digestion, that's a massive one, digestive issues, um, with nervous system dysregulation, just because of what stress does to your digestion, basically. Um, and
So just to,
yeah.
before we continue, just to really kind of make sure this word dysregulation is understood. Dysregulated nervous system means that your body is stuck in the stressed part of the nervous system kind of journey. Is that kind of a easy way of saying it, or?
Yeah, thank you for asking, because I kind of go off about this and forget that probably not everybody understands what I'm talking about. But from how I understand it, basically, we have what's called a window of tolerance. So that's a window, basically, that our body is able to find this state where we are able to come into this sort of safe relaxation. We can connect to other people, we can feel our emotions, we're able to process things, we're able to learn and focus, and all of the things that we really need to do in order to live a good, fulfilling life. That's also where creativity happens. Um, when our nervous system is dysregulated, that window is typically very, very narrow. So, what happens is we way more easily move into, jump into that like hypervigilant fight or flight response, or we very easily go into this. It's called the dorsal vagal response, or the freeze response. So it's basically, instead of having our nervous system kind of respond to stress in a way where it's able to rebalance easy and kind of flow, it's like we're more in this sort of like up and down kind of, we're going into hypervigilance, and then we're freezing, and then we're, a lot of the time, a lot of us that have a dysregulated nervous system are often, um, like very numb or dissociated, which is it's a survival response for the body to self-protect against threat. And it's a very physiological, biological, mammalian response that happens with all mammals in nature. So, for example, when I've gone outside of my window, they call it moving outside of my window, into fight or flight, that would manifest as like panic attacks, crippling generalized anxiety. Like you would just feel like you're being just like attacked by something, you know, like anxiety, it just feels awful. And then on the other end of that, moving into that sort of freeze response, that's where you would get more of kind of like the depression, the apathy, the frozenness, the numbness. So what I'm learning now is that dysregulation is also hugely connected to a lot of these sort of chronic illnesses, such as autoimmune disease, things like Crohn's, colitis, Hashimoto's, psoriasis, just these inflammatory illnesses. There's been a lot of research done now that is linking these inflammatory illnesses, these chronic illnesses, to early adversity and early trauma. So that is a huge interest of mine, and I'm just like pretty obsessed with learning about it.
Well, I mean, it's stress is fascinating. It's not something that makes a life easy. To have a dysregulated nervous system or to be living with chronic stress, but it's fascinating, and it's something we're all meant to have, and it's something that our bodies are supposed to go into that fight or flight response when it needs to protect us, but we're meant to be able to come back out of it. So just like you sort of said, like an animal in the wild, it's getting chased, the body will put in all these amazing mechanisms to protect it and make it run faster and make it think the things it needs to think in order to protect itself. But then when the stress is gone, it's supposed to leave us and we're supposed to go back on our merry way. But now so many people, like you've talked about, have gotten stuck in that chronic stress place and haven't been kind of pull themselves out. And that's what leads to like the inflammation that you talk about.
Yeah. And one of the things that I feel the most passionate about, just because of a lot of the experiences that I've had that have been really challenging, is like you said, like pulling yourself out. Well, how do you pull yourself out of that, right? And in my case, there's been a great deal of shame that I've carried for not being able to pull myself out of these nervous system states. And basically what I'm learning is that in order to do that, and in order to learn how to do that, the number one thing that a human or any mammal requires is safe connection and co-regulation with another nervous system. So when we don't have that in our developmental years, it's like when we're born. I'm obsessed with Gabor Mate. Are you familiar with him? Yeah. So he talks about a lot about how when we're born, our nervous system is not developed. It hasn't finished developing. And so we rely on they call it attunement, the like co-regulation of our primary caregivers and connecting to their nervous system in order for our nervous system to learn how to regulate. So we're born really only being able to go into that stress response, and we depend on attunement and co-regulation with our primary caregiver in order for our nervous system to learn how to come out of that. Mm-hmm. And so if our caregivers are dysregulated, or they are carrying their own unresolved trauma, or they are stressed, or they are disconnected, our system doesn't learn how to do that. And it's very physiological. And I think a lot of the symptoms of that have become very pathologized in our culture. And there's a lot of shame also associated with being in those stuck states, because I think we've really glorified, um, like, individuality and being able to go it alone and do things yourself. And what I've learned in my own health journey is that it's not even a matter of like just pull up your bootstraps. Like it's physiologically impossible to do. Like we are totally reliant on that co-regulation in order to learn that. And I think that's where we see, and this is just my belief, and it's something I'm interested in, and I like learning more about as well. But I think that's also where a lot of these quote unquote like addictive behaviors or like self-soothing techniques that are seen to be maladaptive fall into place as well. Because when you aren't able to regulate your own nervous system physiologically, and you don't have safe connection, or connection is scary to you because it's been unsafe in the past, then what else do you do to regulate? You reach for something that is available to you, that is safe. And so that's something that I feel very passionate about as well, because that's definitely something that has been a part of my journey in various ways, and different tools I used and just carried a lot of shame about for a really long time. And I'm starting now to understand the purpose and the intelligence in a lot of those behaviors, which is helping to take a lot of the shame away. And that is in itself really, it feels really empowering.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I hope it is incredibly empowering. I think something we've talked about, just you and I, before, is this word disorder. And
Mm-hmm.
I think it was you who said, or I gave me a different definition other than saying disorder, and an adaptive way of coping, I think is what you said.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, this
Yeah.
learned way to cope with a dysregulated nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
you go.
Just, yeah, and that was what kept me stuck for such a long time, because I was doing a lot of talk therapy, and I was doing a lot of learning around, like, it was all very cognitively based, and it was a lot around like, okay, what are these really messed up things that you're doing? That let's try to get rid of those things, right? Like let's just like let's stop you from doing those things. But for me, and this is one of the reasons I'm so obsessed with trauma informed practice, because what was missing for me for 20 years in my healing journey, really, and even before that, was the understanding that all of these behaviors were serving a very deeply intelligent purpose, and that actually they were brilliant survival strategies that I had used when my physiology was not capable of regulating itself. And I mean, it's hard, yeah, because like a lot of these things, and just like to sort of like kind of name them and be more specific. I mean, I think there's a lot of different things we could use, but like, examples would be, yeah, like disorder. I don't like that word. Different like eating habits maybe that don't serve us, or different maybe like self-harm strategies, consuming drugs and alcohol, exercise addiction. These are all things that I have definitely, that have been a part of my journey to learning how to self-regulate. And so a lot of the previous therapy that I had done was focused on trying to get rid of those things, right? And for me, that just added shame onto this dysregulation that I was already experiencing. And so the piece that was missing for me was the understanding that, holy crap, like, yeah, this maybe is no longer serving me, but like, how freaking brilliant is that I like found a way to stay alive and to continue to move forward.
Yeah, and that like I'm so passionate about trying to share this idea that our bodies are incredibly brilliant and sincerely always trying to protect us. Now, the ways that it does that, no, they're not necessarily ideal for us on the outside, you know, feeling that crippling anxiety or fears of things and panic and all sorts of things. But it's always the body's sincere desire to protect us. That's why it's doing these things.
Mm-hmm.
I would say I have a similar experience in sense of when I was really getting help with my, I'll just say disorder because I'll just say it, the words.
Yeah.
And going through again a lot of talk therapy. There was a lot of CBT and there was a lot of DBT, and oh my gosh, it did nothing. It did nothing. Now, later on, you know, I definitely use that as part of my coaching and my practice.
Yeah.
But it wasn't until I started to work with my physical body in a way that
Mm-hmm.
I experience a sensation of healing. And that through, whether I always knew it was what I was doing or not, I'm not sure, but it was finding ways to tell my nervous system that it was.
Yeah.
And so, you know, that came with learning meditation and breathing and just joy and all sorts of things. But it really wasn't until I started working with my body that I began to heal.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's exactly what I found too. And I'm just at the beginning of that. Just because I've been so dissociated from my body for such a long time. And so that's a whole journey in and of itself. Like learning to very, very slowly reconnect. And that's another piece about that is like learning, like, also that was something else that was brilliant at the time. Like at the time, I had to disconnect in order to survive. That was my only choice. And so knowing that like now I have the capacity to, and I've heard that described, like I have a brilliant therapist. He's a trauma informed therapist. And like, I'm so grateful for him. But yeah, he described it to me as top down versus bottom up. So the top down being the cognitive strategies like CBT, DBT, or more in like the intellectual element. And then bottom up being the physiological body-based modalities. And the bottom up stuff is what really has completely changed my life. And I know I'm just at the beginning of that process too, which is exciting.
Yeah, it's a long journey. It's not something like you can't stop or start one day sort of practicing regulation practices and be different. You know, it's your body has years of kind of safety to or trust to get back to regain.
Yeah.
When we talk about the word safety, because like, and you know what, it's honesty is a word I find fascinating. When I was sort of being fed this word when I was going through my own recovery process, I didn't get it. I really didn't understand it. Now I understand, and I coach people in a way that uses that vocabulary to find safety and to help the body feel safe. But in terms of someone who's maybe been brought up highly sensitive, or for whatever reason their nervous system has become dysregulated, can you just somehow explain what this safety concept is?
Like in what way? You mean like what it means to feel safe?
Yeah, and is it different? Is it different for everyone's personal experience to know what is safe?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like I want to preface everything that I say, and maybe this isn't giving myself enough credit, but like I can only speak from my own learning and my own experiences on my journey. But as far as I understand it, I mean, if you're talking about physiologically, my understanding would be of, you know, the body really feeling and being able to come to a place where those survival mechanisms can kind of step down a little bit. And I think a big piece of that for me in regards to being highly sensitive and how my nervous system was shaped, and I think how those things tie together for me is constantly sort of having this idea in my development of being too much. Like it was like I felt things so deeply, and my feelings were so powerful, and the people around me didn't have the tools to regulate their own emotions. And so to them, that was probably very threatening, like I think we're only really able to hold space for what we're able to hold space for, like within ourselves. And so it was sort of constantly this feeling of like too muchness, like my feelings and who I am is just too much. It's too much for you. And so I need to tone myself down in order to maintain this sense of like safety or connection with my primary caregivers. And I think when you're a child, that attachment trumps authentic self-expression, right? So it's like you need that connection in order to survive. So you will do whatever you have to do, and it's totally unconscious, to maintain that connection. And so in my case, that was just shutting down my emotions. And in order to do that, I had to disconnect from my body. So there was never that sense of safety of like, I can experience my full expression.
Yeah.
I can experience my full range of emotion. And I think the only way to really learn that you can tolerate your emotions is for initially, when we're very young, or even in adulthood when we're learning it, is again that co-regulation piece, and like having that kind of held with another nervous system, so you can go through the process of like, okay, this is intense, but like eventually this will pass.
Yeah. I think what confused me so much kind of years ago when I first started hearing this word was I just connected safety with physical, like one is not chasing after me or holding a weapon up to me. So I was physically like safe. And so I was why I was potentially feeling unsafe, as people sort of, and it wasn't till later when I realized that safety can be emotional because we have more needs than just the physical. Like that attachment piece that you have touched on is a core need. It's a survival need. And and on that, sort of like to our body, the body doesn't necessarily care whether we are being chased by a lion or our emotional needs aren't being met. Stress is stress. Threat to survival is a threat to survival.
Yeah.
So I think that brings up another shame piece, or anyone who sort of feels like, oh, but I'm fine. Like I shouldn't be struggling because, everything around me I have a roof over my head. I afford food, whatever. I'm fine. But safety is so much deeper than that. And would you say that it really, like this idea of safety really does go back to the perceptions that are built as children?
I mean, pardon me?
Or like does it vary? I don't know. Is that kind of,
I mean, I feel like, again, like I can only really speak to my own experience, but like a lot of my journey has involved understanding that a lot of the symptoms and a lot of the experiences that I've had, certainly a lot of them have been a result of things that happened, but most of it has been a result of things of what didn't happen. So needs that weren't met. And I feel like that's something that's deeply misunderstood in our society, and really kind of what was so confusing for me for such a long time was I was like, I have, all of these I had all of these things in my life that you're supposed to have, like in regards to basic needs. And that's what was so confusing for such a long time. And my learning is that a lot of the experiences that I've had and the symptoms that I've had have been results of what I didn't have, what was actually missing, and how that need for emotional connection and being able to fully self-express is so important to our development, and is so physiological. Like, that's the thing that I have about, like, I don't want to get off on a tangent here, but I feel like part of my journey on this planet, I feel like, is going to evolve around this idea of mental health, which, again, like I said earlier, I'm so passionate about. But again, what I struggle with is that there is this deep, I think, misunderstanding and stigma around that concept. And there shouldn't be, for one, regardless. But I feel like one of the reasons that it's so misunderstood is, like, at least in my journey for myself, I've just learned how connected everything is, and how much the nervous system is just, it's full body. Like, emotions do not happen in our minds. They partially happen in our minds, but they exist in our bodies. Like,
it's full body and it's powerful. Our bodies are very powerful.
mm-hmm.
So Reilly, a while ago you mentioned the word trauma, but you said something about a lot of people don't like to use that word.
Mm-hmm.
Curious about that. Is trauma not a word that is okay to use, or what?
I think my take on that is, and what I've experienced for myself, is that people, I think the way that our culture and the way that the concept of trauma is medicalized as well is very extreme and very black and white. And it's like, we've looked at it, I think, historically, in regards to, like, okay, if someone's been in a major car accident, or if someone is a war veteran and has been over in Iraq, or if, these major, what I've learned are called big T traumas, the more sort of obvious, often like one-off events that will sometimes lead people to develop or experience trauma symptoms, and that then can be categorized and like then labeled as, like, okay, like, you have PTSD, that's what this is. And on my own journey for myself, I've learned that that is so not the case. And a lot of what I was experiencing was actually a result of trauma or traumatic experiences. And I think that maybe because of that, the perception, that sort of extreme perception of what trauma is and what trauma looks like, I think it's kind of like, maybe it can be like a scary or an overwhelming topic for people. And understandably, a really hard one, because it's not easy to look at things that have happened to you, or things you've experienced, or things you haven't experienced in your life. And frankly, the only reason that I went down that road was because my health was just such a mess that I had to. Like, it's hard.
Yeah.
But I think also, like, another piece of that is this idea that, like, time heals all wounds, or, that's in the past, we just need to move on. Like, in my learning, in my experience, that is one of the most damaging things that we could possibly say to anybody, because the way that these experiences impact our bodies and our brains and our nervous systems, we're still living it. We're still there. which also ties back to your concept of like, what does safety look like? It's like you can be in a place that's safe now, but if you haven't processed these things that you experienced or didn't experience, your physiology probably still feels like it's there.
Yeah, it literally lives in our body. Talk like so toxic stress.
Hmm.
Could that be a synonym for trauma, or is there still some sort of difference?
I think so. I mean, again, I'm not a therapist or a psychologist or anything like that, but I've read a lot about it, and I've definitely heard those two terms used synonymously. Is that the right word?
Toxic stress also meaning unprocessed emotions, unprocessed stress.
Yeah. So the way that I've heard it explained um, is so animals in the wild when okay, so say there's like a gazelle, and this is I'm referencing Peter Levine. He's a psychologist from the United States who coined this process called somatic experiencing, and I started learning about it a number of years ago in a trauma informed yoga training, and it just blew my mind. But um, so a gazelle in the wild, if it's being attacked by a predator and it senses that it will be killed, its nervous system will go into that freeze response like we were talking about earlier. And that's a self-preservation response because that gazelle's physiology is trying to help it survive, because if it plays dead, it's less likely to be eaten. Maybe it can like trick the predator into thinking that it's dead and it will leave it alone. So say that happens and the predator leaves the gazelle alone. What happens in nature, and they found in studying animals, is that the gazelle will come out of that freeze response by releasing that pent up fight or flight energy that happened when it was being threatened by the predator, and it will do that by shaking, oftentimes by shaking. So like you can even go on YouTube online and look it up, just like somatic release or somatic experiencing, and there's videos of what happens in nature in the wild. And so in my learning and my understanding is often what happens with us as humans is we bypass that step. So our physiology is like, we're mammals. Our physiology does the same thing. So if we're under threat and we're not able to fight, we're not able to flee, then our physiology will oftentimes or could possibly put us into what's left to protect us, which is to go into that freeze response. But that can often mean that then, it's not like we're so repressed, I think, in our culture. And so oftentimes we won't go through these natural processes to release that stress energy. And then that gets held in the body, and that leads to all kinds of different issues like inflammation and I guess what we would refer to as mental illness. And it causes severe dysregulation in the nervous system. One of the things that started happening to me that kind of cued me into this process was that I would have triggers in my life that reminded my body and my brain of things I had experienced in the past, and my body would go into a trauma response, or I would have flashbacks, or I would have like my body would shake, and it was all because I had had these experiences that were stored in my nervous system that were unprocessed. And that's one of the things that I believe led to my chronic fatigue and my autoimmune disease. And also a lot of the mental emotional symptoms I've experienced. And so now what's happening is my body is kind of slowly waking up. It's coming out of that freeze response that it was stuck in for, honestly, probably longer than 20 years, probably like a very long time, is my body is shaking a lot and shuddering a lot and twitching a lot. And it's really interesting because I know now that that process is like, it's this beautiful natural process of my body releasing what it actually didn't originally get the opportunity to release because I wasn't safe. I didn't have that safety I needed for my body to come out of that freeze response.
Yeah, it's amazing. So I don't know if you want to mostly kind of stick to what you've been doing and experiencing or talk a little bit more about what you've learned, but how does someone begin to tell their body it's safe? Or how can someone safely begin to regulate their nervous system?
Hmm. Well, once again, I can only speak to my own experiences. Excuse me. But from what I've learned, for myself, it has taken, and I'm still working on this, but it's taken a lot of, um, how can I put this? It's taken time, and it's always just been about connection. It's just been about connection. So, one of the reasons that my nervous system has been so dysregulated and remained in that hypervigilant frozen state is because it didn't feel safe in connection. Um, and so, in order to come out of that state or in order to learn how to regulate, it had to sense safety in connection with another human being, which is like often very hard if you've had, I think, a lot of relational trauma or if you've had a lot of experiences of lack of safety. And I think that's one of the reasons it can be so hard and take so much time and so much work. Um, and for me, I don't want to discourage anyone or anything like that. But I will share that it took about 3 years of working with my current therapist to get to the point where my body slowly began to thaw out. And it's not necessarily how long it's going to take for everybody. I think like everyone's system is different. For me, I was working with decades of different types of, lack of safety, including a lot of medical trauma and things I had been through just from there not being an understanding of what was going on with me. But it took just basically the way I've heard it described is it's like if you want a turtle to come out of its shell, are you going to like walk up to the shell and like bang on the shell to try to get it to come out? Or are you just going to like, you're probably just going to like sit there and like try to just like show it that it's safe, right? And like I think I heard this on one of like the Vagal podcasts I was listening to, but like, and that's how I would describe my experience with my current therapist. It was just like repetition of me connecting with him and my nervous system understanding very slowly that it was safe. Yeah. And then once that happened, and it wasn't just with my therapist, like it was like my therapist was kind of like the initial step. Once that started happening, I started to be able to, like, I have like a cat that I love dearly, and we can co-regulate with pets and with animals. So even just spending time with my cat is showing my nervous system how to safely connect with something where I can like be my authentic self, which is kind of amazing. And that's one of the reasons that like things like equine therapy can be so effective, apparently, because you're connecting with another nervous system. It's not a person, but it's another mammal. And so that can be very helpful in healing from trauma and doing like nervous system work, which is just like mind blowing to me. Because it's that co-regulation with another nervous system.
Yeah, that attachment piece is huge, and I think almost maybe unrecognized in many of us. I know attachment has a huge connection with eating disorders.
Yeah.
And that sense of interoception and high sensitivity, they all have so together. It's this like
Yeah.
this is where I end and where you begin, but
Yeah.
become really confused at one point. And you're right, if there's been attachment unsafety in your past, that affects you on so many levels. So
Yeah.
many levels.
Yeah. Yeah, and how brilliant of your system to remember that and say, like, this is not safe for me to be in connection with other people, or it's not safe for me to be in connection with myself. And a huge part of my journey that I want to be transparent about was years and years and years and years of seeking different forms of support and different forms of help and being either not seen and heard or very pathologized or very, seen as being different or other, which had the total it had a really detrimental effect on my physical and mental health because what I needed now, I realized was safe connection. Like that's just been the forefront of everything. That's at the heart of everything.
Yeah.
And it took having my current therapist who is trauma informed to see that. But unfortunately, it took me 20 years, and I think some people never get that, and that I think that has to change.
Yeah, there can be a lot of labels and a lot of band-aids placed on issues that run way deeper than that, obviously.
Hmm.
In terms of the healing process that you were just talking about, exposure therapy is kind of out there and all this stuff, but it can be so important to sort of like that window of tolerance that you talked about, this it needs to be stretched slowly. It needs to be
Yeah.
slowly. If someone, like, again, I'll talk about eating because of the clients that I work with. If someone has fears surrounding food, you're not just going to throw them into the scariest restaurant with their scariest meal in front and say, "Kate, healing process is starting," or
Yeah.
someone who has anxiety in social situations. To begin to heal, you're not just going to throw them into a huge party and put them on stage to talk. It's
Yeah.
these compassionate, slow acts that are like we're stretching for tolerance slowly and safely.
Yeah.
The nervous system doesn't just go way too much and retreat again,
Yeah. 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 Thank you for sharing that because that's exactly the experience that I've had so often in my life has been this. And it was because I didn't understand that nervous system piece, and I would just become so dysregulated, and I wouldn't be able to sleep or eat, and it's just like my nervous system was just in full blown threat mode. Um, so now because I'm learning regulatory tools, and I'm learning about breath work, and I'm learning like what are ways that I can regulate my nervous system, and I can track my nervous system state better.
Wow.
And I can even reach out for like co-regulation, which has not been easy for me in the past because,
Hmm,
you
that's
know,
spectacular. That's amazing. I'm curious. So, in terms of your work and creativity, has creativity been a form of co-regulation for you in any way?
yeah, I think like now that I understand a bit more about all of this, it makes a lot of sense for me why I've been so attached to creativity and particularly music because like just learning a lot about the nervous system, how it works in particular, um, the vagus nerve, which like, oh man, I don't know if we have time to like get into that, but basically it's this really important um thing. It's this really important part of our physiology that is really connected to our body's capacity and our nervous system's capacity to regulate. And so what I learned is that when I'm singing, that actually is stimulating my vagus nerve, which is um, tuning my physiology in a way basically that is making my nervous system more regulated and strengthening my capacity to regulate. And that's this really cool physiological process. And that is like really also connected to like chanting and yoga and any sort of like vocal, like deep vocal, like belly sound that you're making is going to apparently like tone your, how do they call it? Yeah, stimulate your vagus nerve to increase, they call it vagal tone. And so I think for like most of my life, I used music has always been just like a huge tool for me. And I think I didn't realize that I was using it to regulate. I just knew that I felt good when I did it.
Yeah.
Which is enough. But especially when I was a kid, because I think it was one of the places where I was able to find like some semblance of like that safety and calm,
Yeah.
because it was a safe, neutral place.
Yeah. And, you know, really at the end of the day, we don't have to understand how something is working. It's that joy piece, you know, if music and singing brings you or anyone else joy, then that is going to work to bring you into a state of health. You know,
Mhm.
the next level of kind of wanting to understand things from a nerdier perspective is knowing that that's actually physically doing something in you and literally massaging this
Yeah.
nerve in you that has the
Mhm.
power to tell your body it's safe.
Mhm.
That's all kind of extra. And you know, when I coach people and I coach them to sing and I coach them to make funny noises and to hum and to dance and to shake, all these things,
Mhm.
I'm, I'm not just doing it for to elicit some sense of joy. That is a great part of it, but
Mhm.
that there's actual biological reasoning behind it as well.
Mhm. And so do you share that with them, like the biological reasoning, or do you just like suggest they do it? I'm curious.
More so suggest, but it's always along the lines of finding that safety and finding calm in ourselves.
Mhm.
I don't really go into the vagus nerve thing unless they, you know, are really interested or we're head that way. But
Okay.
I'm more so I just coach ways to calm the nervous system is how I'd put it, and I'll just mention that
Cool.
there are ways to do that.
That's so awesome. Hmm.
So like it's like you and I think I both have experienced it. Like
Mhm.
when we're singing or doing creative things or just doing anything that's aligned with our passion, you know,
Yeah.
that's when we feel safe,
Yeah.
really.
Yeah, it's true. Well, and then to take that a step further, like this is one of the other reasons that I'm so obsessed with nervous system is because I'm learning that where creativity happens is in that window of tolerance. So if we are dysregulated, then it's going to be extremely challenging for us to be creative in any way. And that's, I think, also another reason why creativity is so regulating. It's like creativity happens in that space, um, that window of tolerance space. They call it like your ventral vagal complex where you're connected and you have that feeling of safety. And so that just made a ton of sense to me too. It's like another reason, like as if we need another reason to learn how to regulate. But if we did, that's another reason. And then I think if we're having trouble finding our creativity, that can be one of the reasons why too.
Hmm, that's really interesting.
Hmm.
So are you
It's almost like, sorry,
no go? Go.
it's just, it's survival trumps everything. Survival trumps everything. So if we're in a survival state, we're not going to be able to learn, connect, attach, be creative. Like it's just, yeah.
Fear will always override logic.
Hmm.
You know, it goes down to even just the day-to-day things of if you're stressed, you probably can't focus on that work piece or that deadline or whatever it is. And if something's worrying about you, your brain's going to go there, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And then if you're in a chronic stressed place, life, day-to-day life is going to feel hard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
So just as we wrap up here, is there anything else that you kind of want to, I don't know, share to anyone who is maybe going through a similar experience or trying to figure out their own nervous system workings, or maybe has some trauma in their past that they're dealing with? Anything else that you'd want to share or say?
Yeah, I think I just want to share that, and again, like I can only speak from personal experience, but I do want to share that and reiterate that for me on my health journey, um, probably the single biggest like missing piece was the trauma piece, just because it just literally impacts everything. And like, I want to say especially in regards to mental health, but not even, because it's like equally in regards to physical health as well. But that was never something that was ever talked about with me in the years that I was struggling. And I feel like that is going to continue to be, at least I hope, an area become more and more like an area of like focus, or that hopefully it will become more mainstream, because I think it has to, especially with everything that's going on right now. And so I found that maybe this isn't for everybody, but for me, I have always had a much easier time working with something if I understood it. And a lot of what I was dealing with were trauma related symptoms, and I just didn't understand them at all because it just was not a part of the mainstream medical narrative. And so I think what I want to say to anyone that's struggling is actually, I think this is what I want to say. I think from what I've learned, I don't believe, my serious firm belief is that the way that we look at trauma is very extreme. And I actually think like if you're human, you've experienced trauma. Like that is just, I think, just like a fact. And so if you are experiencing symptoms like that, like it's it's just so normal. And it's awful. It can be really a hard thing to deal with, but yeah, just there's nothing wrong with you. I think that's what I want to say.
Well, you're doing it. You are sharing inspiration, and you are an inspiration, and your story is an inspiration, and you're very motivating. And so thank you for sharing everything that you did about your own journey, and all that you've experienced and all that you've just learned. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Cora. Thank you for having me and talking to me.